In this lesson we're going to be revising paper 2, which is the reading non-fiction and transactional writing paper. We're going to be revising all aspects of the paper, although we're going to spend most of the time looking at section A, the reading section, because we've just finished doing the transactional writing, and so that's relatively fresh in your minds, but I will come on and just very quickly revise that right at the end of this session. So the objectives for this lesson are that by the end of the session you will know what is required for each question on paper 2. Now Edexcel have recently revised their requirements for some of the questions, so I will provide you with the updated information on those so that you understand how to provide effective answers for each of the questions on paper 2 within the time constraints of the paper and the time constraints for each particular question. And that means that you'll be able to go on and respond appropriately to all of the questions on paper 2 in section A and section B when you come on to do the full mock exam. Okay, so we'll start with section A. This is the reading non-fiction section, and it's 1 hour and 15 minutes long. So to recap what's involved in section A, you get 2 unseen non-fiction texts which share a common theme. Those non-fiction texts will always be modern. One will be 20th century and one will be 21st century. One of those texts will always be a form of literary non-fiction. The other text might be literary non-fiction, but it might also be media non-fiction. So you need to be familiar with the conventions of literary non-fiction and media non-fiction. There are 7 questions in total in section A, and they are testing your reading skills. They're testing 3 distinct reading skills: skimming, scanning and reading for meaning. Because they're testing your reading skills, the examiners will not be looking at your spelling, your punctuation and your grammar. You will not lose marks for poor spelling, punctuation and grammar directly. The only time that you will lose marks for that is if your spelling, your punctuation, your grammar, maybe your syntax is so off that it makes it difficult for the examiner to understand what you are trying to say, and in that case they simply can't give you the mark if they can't understand your meaning. Okay. You get 3 questions on text 1 and then you get 3 questions on text 2. And I would suggest reading text 1 and answering the questions on text 1, and then reading text 2 and answering the questions on text 2. Questions 1 and 2 on text 1 and questions 4 and 5 on text 2 will always focus on a specific section of the text. You will be given a line reference and you will be asked to retrieve some information from those particular line references. You must make sure that the information you retrieve comes only from the section that you've been directed to. If it comes from anywhere else in the text, you automatically lose that mark. The examiners cannot award marks if you have found the information from elsewhere in the text. So I would suggest highlighting the line references that you're given to make sure you look at the right section of text in there. Question 3 on text 1 and question 6 on text 2 test your reading for meaning. They require longer answers and you are expected to cover the text as a whole text in question 3 and question 6. So the shorter questions will direct you to particular sections, the longer questions will direct you to talk about the text as a whole. The final question on the paper, question 7, is 1 question, but it is split into 2 parts. Both of those parts require a comparison of the 2 texts, and you are expected to deal with the 2 texts equally when you're answering both 7A and 7B, and we'll come on to that later in the session. Let's have a look at the short answer questions then. So we have questions 1 and 2 on text 1 and questions 4 and 5 on text 2. They are low scoring, they're worth 1 or 2 marks. They're testing your ability to scan for particular details and pick out individual words, and also your ability to skim read and get a general sense of what the text is about. In terms of the sort of answer they're looking for, they require nothing more than simple information retrieval. All you have to do is lift the relevant quote, put it on the paper, and in the case of question 2 and question 5, provide a very, very brief explanation of how that language feature is being used. But they don't want detailed analysis, they don't want lots of explanation, they certainly don't want paid paragraphs. Your answers need to be short, as I said, often just a single word, and importantly, you need to keep within the space that is provided for you on the exam paper. You're given either 1 or 2 lines to write your answer in, and your answer must fit in that line. If you're going over that, you're writing too much and you are wasting time. You need to keep it short and you need to do it quickly, okay? The number of marks gives you a good indication of how much you should be writing, but also how long you should spend. And Edexcel have said that the rule is 1 mark equals 1 minute. So if there is a question worth 1 mark, you should only be spending 1 minute answering it. Now, there is obviously an issue with that, in that that doesn't take into consideration how long it takes people to read a question, understand what they're being asked for, go and find it and then put it on the exam paper. But basically you need to do those questions as quickly as you possibly can and move on. You need to put an answer for every single question on the paper. If you put the wrong answer for a question worth 1 mark because you've done it very quickly, that's not ideal, but it's not as bad as spending too long trying to find the correct answer for a question worth 1 mark and finding that you've run out of time to answer the longer questions that are worth 14, 15 marks. Do these low scoring ones really, really quickly as you can, and move on. Okay, now we come to question 3. Question 3 is on text 1. It will always ask you to analyse how language and structure have been used for particular effect. Now, you must comment on specific features of language and structure. If you only comment on language or you only comment on structure, no matter how good those comments are, you cannot move beyond level 2 in the mark scheme. They must be specific, because when we analyse, what we're doing is zooming in on specific words, phrases, techniques that the writer has used. Okay, and what we're trying to do when we analyse is not just to identify those and name them, but to explain how they are being used to create meaning, what particular effect they create within the text as a whole. It isn't enough just to identify particular types of words or techniques or phrases. You must always explain how they are being used by that particular writer. In identifying and commenting on these techniques and these words, you are expected to use the correct technical terminology. So you would be expected to know and be able to use terms like rhetorical questions, terms like pronouns, third person, things like 3-part lists, metaphors, similes. There is an expectation that you will be using that terminology when talking about the features that you are identifying and analysing. Your response to question 3 must be written as a full PED essay, point, evidence, explanation and development. And remember, it is 1 mark a minute. This question is worth 15 marks, so you only spend 15 minutes answering this question. So having told you what you have to do, you have to now be able to do that within 15 minutes. So if we're looking for language and structural features, there are lots of these, and not every text is going to have the same set of language features or the same set of structural features, and you're going to have to use your judgment. You're going to have to learn the things that you've got listed on the various handouts that you've already had, and you're going to have to train your eye to spot those and think about how they're being used. But just as an example, I've put together a couple of very short lists of the kinds of things that you would find in most non-fiction text. It is not, these lists are not exhaustive, and you may not find these in the text. These are just to give you an idea of the kind of thing that you might comment on. So in terms of language features, you could always look at the pronouns that are being used. Think about whether they're first person, second person, third person generic, and think about why the writer is using those. What does that suggest about their relationship to their reader? Look at the overall formality of the language. Is it very formal? Is it written in standard English? Is there lots of technical terminology in there? What kind of text is it? Or is it more informal? Think about the letter from the mock exam you did previously. That was very informal, lots of colloquialisms, lots of kind of personal references in there, which showed the affection of the soldier for his wife. So the formality can indicate the relationship between reader and writer. Look for what we call rhetorical devices, the kinds of things that you find in persuasive text, argumentative text, speeches, that sort of thing. Things like three-part lists or rhetorical questions. Both of those can also count as an element of structure. So if you see one, you can kind of hit the language and structure requirement by commenting on it as a language feature and also as a structural feature. Look at emotive language. Now, most people are able to identify emotive language, language that provokes a strong emotional response. So look at the type of emotion it's provoking. Is it positive? Is it negative? Are they building the emotion as they go through? Are they sort of laying it on with a trowel as they're going on in their text? Then look for things that are perhaps a little bit more literary. Things like alliteration, where you have words, a series of words next to each other or very close to each other within a sentence that all begin with the same consonant sound. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same letter, but it's the sound that it makes that creates the alliteration. And then look for figurative devices, the sorts of things that we find in poetry, in novels, in short stories. Metaphors, similes, personification, onomatopoeia. All of those can be found in lots of pieces of literary non-fiction. Think back to the travel writing that we did. That is layered with lots and lots of literary devices, lots of these figurative devices. And then all texts are going to contain verbs, because sentences contain verbs. So look at the verbs. Are they active? Are they passive? How are they associated with the noun? Are they modal verbs? Are they suggesting? Or are they imperative? Are they commanding? And then that will help you lead into looking at the sentence structures and the sentence forms. So in terms of structural features, you can look at the overall structure, the big picture. Is it linear? Is it non-linear? How is the writer guiding us through the information? How are they guiding at eye? Are they zooming us in? Are they moving us around as they're taking us through this text? Where is our attention being focused? Look for time shifts. Look at the tenses that are being used. Do they use a consistent tense, or like a game of polo with a headless goat, do they go from past tense to present tense and keep switching backwards and forwards? Maybe they project into the future as well. If they do, think about why they're doing that. Look at the sentence structures and forms. Look at the variety of those and think about why they are there. Any use of lists. So we said three-part lists can be used as a structural feature. Bulleted lists, numbered lists, any kind of list is going to be a structural feature. Even if it's just a list separated by commas and semicolons within a sentence, that is still worth commenting on as a structural feature. Look at the paragraphing. So look at the topic sentences and think about how this writer has ordered their ideas. How are they making the events flow together? How are they linking their ideas and creating a cohesive text for you to read? Then look at the use of repetition. Maybe the writer is repeating a key phrase at different points in the text. Maybe they're repeating a key image. They keep referring to an image and perhaps building on it a little bit as they go further through their text. That again is an element of structure, but it's also an element of language. Repetition is a language feature as well. So you can see a lot of these features sort of cross over between language and structure. And then look for any use of juxtaposition, where a writer will put two completely opposite ideas together to create a really unusual sentence. Or maybe they'll use contrast, so you might have contrasting ideas between paragraphs or between sentences. So they are some suggestions of the sorts of things that you can look at when you're looking for language and structural features when you're answering the question 3 on text 1. So now we come to question 6. Question 6 is on text 2 and it will always ask you to evaluate. It is going to ask you to evaluate the way that the writer of that text is presenting the main theme in text 2. When we evaluate, that means taking a step back away from the minutiae of metaphors, similes, verb choices, pronouns, and looking at the bigger picture, taking a critical look at the text as a whole work of non-fiction. Okay? Do not zoom in and comment on specific words, phrases and techniques when you're answering question 6. That is what you do for question 3. When you're answering question 6, what you do need to do is to explain in far more general terms how successfully, convincingly, persuasively, whatever it might be, the writer has presented whatever element of sight it is, so their subject, their ideas, their themes or their events, that is mentioned in the question. Having said you need to talk generally and take the broad view, you do still need to back up your comments with textual references, although they can be more general. You don't need to use the technical terminology, you don't need to name each individual technique and pull each quote apart, but you do still need textual references to support the comments that you're making. Don't try and be too detailed. You have a limited amount of space. You have 1 page of lined paper in the exam booklet to answer this. You need to keep within that space and not go over it, because a little bit like the earlier questions, if you're going over that space, you're writing too much. This one is worth 15 marks. So again, with the mark a minute rule, you're only going to spend 15 minutes answering this question. Now, to answer this question, you need to evaluate, and the examiners are going to be looking for evaluative language being used. So let's look at some words and phrases that you could use when evaluating in response to question 6. So you could use the word successfully. The wording of the question actually has this word successfully in it, and Edexcel have said they just want you to accept that it has been done successfully. So it's a good idea to use this term successfully in your writing. Something like, the writer successfully presents the theme of whatever it might be, and then you go on to explain how they do that. Another word you could use is effectively. Again, it's a nice positive one. It shows you're accepting the premise of the question. Through this text, the writer effectively, and then does whatever it's suggested they've done. You could use the word overall, because that shows that you are dealing with the text as a whole, and this is a useful one to have at the end of your evaluation in response to question 6. So overall the writer has whatever they might have done. And then convincingly, again, this is a nice positive one. The theme of whatever it is convincingly presented in this text because, and again, this is a useful one at the end of your response to question 6 when you're sort of summing up and you're coming to the end of it. So there are some suggestions of words that you can use to answer that evaluative question. Now, question 7 is one question split into 2 sections. We have 7A, and 7A is always going to ask you to comment on the similarities between the 2 texts in relation to a particular aspect of sight, so a particular aspect of subject, ideas, themes or events. Edexcel have now, this is one of the ones where they've sort of refined their requirements, and what they're saying now is that you only need 3 similarities to answer this question. You need to identify 3 similarities. You do not need to explain or analyse those similarities in any way, and you do not need to write your response in a PED essay. Okay. You do, however, need to write in full sentences, so it would not be acceptable to simply list the similarities and a few quotes. You must write in full sentences and you must have it in paragraphs. However, they've got a very formulaic method for doing this, and what they want you to do is this. They want you to state the similarity that you've identified. They then want you to provide a quote, a direct quote from text 1, which illustrates or shows that aspect that you've identified as being similar. They then want you to provide a quote from text 2 showing that aspect, and then they want you to repeat steps 1, 2 and 3 above for the other 2 similarities that you've identified. It is very formulaic, but it's only worth 6 marks, so you only have 6 minutes to answer this question. All right, let's have a look at how that works in practice. So here is a response to 7a. Okay, the 2 texts show people taking care of others. What similarities do Bert and Jack share in these extracts? Use evidence from both texts to support your answer. So in this response, we can see straight away that this person has identified a similarity. Both writers, so they're dealing with both texts, both writers show that caring for others gives you a sense of responsibility, and it's that sense of responsibility that they're saying is similar. They then provide a quote from text 1. This is shown when text 1 writes, "Don't let yourself go short," and in text 2 with "constantly hungry child." So it's very simple. There's not much in the way of linking. It is organised into a paragraph. It is in proper sentences. However, you can see that there is no linking of these paragraphs. They're just 3 little chunky paragraphs on 3 different similarities, and all they've done is just to repeat that process. So we get both writers show the importance of dealing with this responsibility positively, such as when Bailey cares for his wife by only talking about the weather and not the war. Similarly, Monroe dusts off her apron to care for her child's needs. Both writers show that food plays a significant part in caring for others. Bailey shows that butter is always welcome, and Monroe shows small boy is healthier as a result of her changes. So there's no connection between those similarities other than they're all about caring for people. You're not having to write topic sentences, you're not having to write PED, and you're not explaining the quotes that you're providing. Now, this person wasted a bit of time here. They didn't need this bit at the bottom because they've got their 3 similarities, and on those 3 similarities they scored 5 out of 6. Okay, once you've identified your 3 similarities and you've provided your quotes, move on, because you need the time to do 7b. So question 7b is always going to ask you to write about the similarities and differences. It won't state similarities and differences in the wording of the question. It will always ask you to compare, which means refer to similarities and differences, and it will always specify a particular aspect of subject, ideas, theme or events. You need to make sure that you cover similarities and differences in your response. You need to be analytical in this one, so you need to focus on how the subject, the idea, the theme or the event is being presented. Your response does need to be a PED essay, okay, but you can reuse quotations that you've used earlier. So you can use the quotations that you've found for 7a, or you can use quotations from earlier responses, but only if they are relevant to the topic of this particular question. Okay, so it saves you time. You don't have to keep going back and looking for the quotes. Reuse things if you possibly can. For this response, you do not have to comment on structure, although you might choose to if it seems to be particularly relevant. All right, you do need to comment on language features, and ideally you should be using your technical vocabulary in response to this one as well. The key thing with this is that you have an equal balance of comments on text 1 and on text 2. And if you think back to those 2 methods that I taught you a while ago about how to compare texts, either of those 2 methods will ensure that you have a balance of comments on text 1 and on text 2. Okay, so remember, it is a mark a minute. This is only worth 14 marks, so you are only going to spend 14 minutes answering this question. That concludes the information about section A, the reading section. We're going to move on now and very quickly recap section B, which is the transactional writing, and you have 45 minutes in total for the transactional writing task. So to recap then, In section B, you're given a choice of 2 transactional writing tasks. You must only choose one. Do not try and do them both. You must only choose one. They want to see an extended writing response. They want you to give your full attention to just one of those tasks. The one transaction writing task that you choose is worth 40 out of the total 96 marks available on the paper. So it is a significant amount of the marks available. So you need to plan and you need to craft your writing and try and hit all the assessment objectives that they've set for this. The theme of both of the tasks will be linked to the theme of the non-fiction text. And that's so that you can use those to source any subject-specific vocabulary, also for inspiration and maybe content, but you must not quote from those 2 texts directly, okay? You need to paraphrase, or you need to take the ideas and work it into your own words. Through the transactional writing, you have to show that you're consciously crafting your writing, that you're making deliberate choices of vocabulary, of content, of spelling, of punctuation, of grammar, that is appropriate to the subject, the purpose, the audience form of the task that you're doing, and that you are trying to create a text that has a very definite impact on the reader that has been specified for that particular task. There are 2 separate mark schemes for the transactional writing. One of the mark schemes focuses only on your spelling, your punctuation and grammar, which accounts for 20% of the total mark. The other one focuses on content and structure, and then those 2 marks are added together to give you the mark out of 40 for the transactional writing. You have a total of 45 minutes to produce your extended writing response. That includes planning and that includes checking. So let's have a look at the key points about the transactional writing. There are 2 separate mark schemes, so you need to think carefully about your content and structure, but you also need to think carefully about your spelling, your punctuation and your grammar, and be as accurate as you possibly can and make appropriate choices for the SPAF of the task. With the transactional writing task, the old adage, failing to plan is planning to fail, really is very, very true. In the examples and in the training that they've done, edXL have provided examples of writing where people haven't planned, and they describe the writing as being rather like a runaway train. It's all terribly exciting to begin with, but very quickly it gets out of control and you start to worry for the safety of the person doing the writing, because they lose all control of their writing. The punctuation goes, there's no linking between the ideas. You must plan, you absolutely must plan. The other thing you must do is allow 5 minutes at the end to go back and check for any spelling, punctuation and grammar errors, and if you spot any, correct them. If you cross it out, put a correction. If you cross it out and don't put a correction, they will have to mark the incorrect one, so make sure you offer a correction if you do cross anything out. Now, as we've seen, you have the main question, the main transactional task, and then you have 3 bullet point suggestions of things that you could include. You don't have to use those. If you've got some really good ideas of your own, you can completely ignore those. The reason they're there is because GCSEs are no longer tiered. So previously some people would do the foundation tier and some people would do the higher tier. Now everybody just does the one paper, but that means that people that would previously have done the foundation tier still need the scaffolding of the bullet points, and that's why they're there, but you do not have to use them if you don't want to. In terms of the time for the transactional writing, this is how you should break up your 45 minutes. 5 to 10 minutes reading the task, understanding the task and planning your response, and within that you need to identify the SPAF of the task, and then your plan is going to be a SPAF plan, so looking at the particular techniques that you're going to use for the purposes that have been set, thinking about how you're going to adapt your vocabulary to suit your audience, thinking about any subject-specific vocabulary that you might use. You then spend between 30 to 35 minutes actually writing your response, and as you're doing that, you need to think about how you're linking your paragraphs, how you're structuring your piece as you're going along, and keep referring back to your plan to help you to do that. and then you need to have your 5 minutes just checking and correcting at the end. Okay, so that's the information on transactional writing. So paper 2 then is 2 hours in total. You have an hour and 15 minutes to do the reading section A on the 2 non-fiction texts. You then have 45 minutes to produce 1 transactional writing response, the theme of which will be linked to the non-fiction reading texts.